Hi, everyone. This is Kovid, back with another episode of Beyond the Code by Typo. Today, with us, we have a special guest. He is currently a CTO in residence with Alpha Wave Group, which is a VC group. He comes with a 20 plus years of engineering and leadership experience. He has worked with multiple startups and orgs like Blinkit as a CTO. He is the guest whom I have met, and he's the only guest whom I have met in person. And I really like talking to him at the SAS Boomi event. Welcome to the show, Jacob. Great to have you
Thanks.
here.
Thanks. Good to be here. Good to chat with you.
Cool. I think let's start with something very unique that I've seen experience with you. That is your name. It's Jacob Singh, right? So how did that fusion happen?
Just seemed like fun, Just can't since I was living in India anyway, I figured Smith is harder to pronounce, so I just kidding. My dad's from here. My dad's Punjabi, so when when a brown boy and a white girl, they love each other a lot. End up with the Jacob Singh. That's about it. There's not much else to it. I grew up in the States, but I've lived in India on and off for the past 20 years. Yeah.
Great, perfect. That's rare to see, at least in India. Most of the generation, maybe half Indian, half American, are in US. But what did you love about India? What made you come here?
Question. I was trying to escape my tech stuff. So I sort of started very early. I taught myself to code as a teenager, started my first business when I was 18 and I'd done pretty well. And then when I was like 21, 22, I just sort of decided I wanted to do something different, do something in the, social sector, helping people. So I took a job with an NGO in West Delhi and sort of shifted for that. That was the original purpose. Why did I stay? I guess there's something dynamic and interesting about the place. India's changed a lot in 20 years, as everybody knows. And I think that's been continuously exciting to be a part of. It doesn't feel stagnant, doesn't feel like, a lot of changes are not in the direction I would love, to be honest. But, but it's an interesting place. There's always something happening. And I found that. And then eventually you build your community, your friends, and your family, and all that sort of stuff. So this is
Right,
home.
right.
Yeah, that's about it.
Perfect. Talking about the family, I was just talking to you on LinkedIn and I found that there was like 1 year break that you took in your career and you were just parenting at that time. And honestly, that's very different and very unique to a culture, to an Indian culture actually. So I just wanted to know how was your experience there? I'm sure it would have made you learn a lot of things as it does for a lot of other parents. But I just wanted to hear about your experience with your kid.
Hopefully, it's not so uncommon. I think it's starting to change, especially the role of men as fathers in India. I think it's traditionally like my dad's father. He just saw him for tea, and he was reading the newspaper, and he'd meet him once a year on his birthday and take him to a quality restaurant for a Coke. That was their relationship. I think things are different with Indian fathers these days. I think for me, we was perfectly honest, was going through a divorce, difficult. I needed to be there for my daughter, and I was, sort of taking half the responsibility in terms of time with her. This was 8 years ago. And I think my parents had also divorced. So I was my dad was a very active part of my upbringing and did all the things, did all the dishes, cooked all the meals, was around. He was also working as a programmer and did all that, but then he was at home as well. And he found ways to make it work, even if it had meant sacrificing his career to some extent. He was working from home when I was a kid in the 80s. So he had a giant IBM 880 or whatever computer, a little tiny green screen, a 300 baud modem, to connect and send his work up. So that's how I grew up. Turned out to benefit me a lot when it came to learning computers. But
Yeah.
he would convince him to do that because he was good at his job, and he's like, I had to be there for my kids, and he made it work. I think we all find those times where we need to lean into family or lean into work in different proportions. Yeah.
Great. I think amazing job there, honestly, Jacob. All right, that was great knowing you, and thanks for that quick intro. Moving on to the main section of our today's podcast, enhancing the developer experience. So that's our topic for today. So let's start with very basic, very simple. What is developer experience according to
What is developer experience? It's an interesting term. I guess it's the day to day of how a programmer gets their job done. I guess the term would be everything encapsulated from how their boss talks to them, how they work with their teammates, the kind of tools they use for project management, down to the quality of documentation, APIs, the kind of tools they use on their computer, the tools they use in the cloud that they work with, et cetera. And all of that encapsulated is how effective can they be at their job, and the environment around them that allows them to be effective, I guess is what I would define it as.
And why do you think it's trending so much these days? I think what you mentioned and what I have also read everywhere about developer experience is the same fundamental that has been existing all the years, right? But why is it trending these days? Why do you think this is something up in the market?
Good question. I guess, I've been around for a while. So I think in the earlier days of the industry, when I first started, engineers were a little expensive, but they were also looked at as like a commodity that you could just use. Like you put them on a spreadsheet, you pay the engineers, you get the work done. They weren't considered really central. They were considered sort of like factory workers in an expensive factory to some extent. I think it was more so in the 80s and 90s, right? But like it's still trending more and more in the direction of engineers kind of being very expensive and being decision makers, moving into C-level positions, having more authority, seeing that like if you just look at, the S&P 500, you look at the stock market and you see that the top companies are all tech companies and they command most of the market cap. I think those days are over. So now it's very much that if you're able to execute with your engineering roadmap, you're able to win the market is considered the basis of a lot of companies' sort of strategies, whether they're a tech company or not. And therefore, the effectiveness of the developers in that team plays into which developers will join you. And when they join you, how likely are they to be engaged and to be retained? And then how effective, is each developer, because they're a rare commodity, because it's hard to find good developers. There's so much demand, et cetera, even in recessionary times. Most of the layoffs are not engineering teams. And so the effectiveness of each engineer and their ability to motivate and retain them becomes paramount to a company's strategy.
Right. Makes sense. So, according to you, I'm sure you have had the experience of seeing this shift in the West as well as in companies in India, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you see the culture, particularly talking about the tech culture in a company, like maybe for example, you work with a company like Blinkit, which is huge today in India, and you must have worked with other companies in the West. How how do you compare, like how teams are being led in these two different cultures?
Well, I would say those kind of, anything I say is going to be a gross generalization and it's going to be incorrect more often than it's correct. I think there's more difference between two Indian companies than there is between any given American or any Indian company. There's a lot of variation. But if I'm being put on the spot to make such generalizations, I would say that one big difference is the age and maturity of engineers. So like when I was 29, I got hired as an IC, like a principal engineer at this company called Acquia. They can acquire my startup and I joined there. And we had PhDs on the team who were ICs, right? Our VP engineering, had 25 years of experience in the field and was, sort of, one of my colleagues was like heading R&D for the RFID team at Sun, like very senior guys who are still writing code.
Yeah.
It's like very much just like in the weeds writing code. They're not trying to be managers. They're not an architect. They're just like a programmer, right? I got my first team like to manage. Like I got small team when I was like 25, 26, but really I got my first team of like really qualified, expensive engineers when I was like 32. Whereas here, my VP engineering at Grofers is like 29. Right? It's like managing 100 people. So it's very common to be much early in your career. Engineers with 3-4 years experience are sort of talking about I should be an ST4. So like the whole like that scale is different. You have a much younger audience in the States. At least when I was coming up, there's a lot more earning your stripes over a long time before you go into management. Whereas here, you have
Right.
a lot more very junior managers. I think that's a big difference.
Okay.
And there's a lot of
That's
other ones.
interesting, actually.
I mean,
No, I think.
that creates a lot of other dynamics, right? I mean, you just have like generally, you have more. I hate to say this, I'm probably gonna take shit for this, but having been an engineering leader in both places, I feel like you have more like discipline and like professionalism issues here generally, which is not to do with Indians. It's just to do with the age of people. Like they're 24 years
No, I
old. They're not going to be very professional, right? Like a lot of your team.
no, totally. I think we are not generalizing this, but as you said, it's probably about the age. In one of my podcasts, I was just talking to this fellow from Spain. He's leading a team of almost 30 folks now. and
Yeah.
50% of them were early 20 hires, right?
Yeah.
And he's that guy. And then I was talking to somebody in India who was leading a 50-member team, where again 50% of the folks were like junior engineers in
Yeah.
their 25s, 26, and both of them had the same issue of handling the Gen Zs.
Yeah.
So I think from where you are coming, it's totally relatable. And I think we touched a very good topic here. How to create a good developer experience for these early age 25, 26 year olds in the system, because they are not stable. They are not. So again, I am also not generalizing. A lot of good folks are there,
Yeah.
but they are not like in the right mindset of sticking to a place, learning gradually, and then making that impact. They just like really want to hop on fast on everything.
Yeah.
So uh, how do you handle that? Because that definitely is a pain for a
It's
lot of folks, not just in India, across the globe.
no, no, I've heard this a lot, and I'm not really sure. I mean, I'm far from Gen Z. I was actually having this exact same conversation with the CTO of an Indian unicorn, a pretty large one, who was talking about the same thing. He's like, how do I motivate these seems like the younger guys, they don't really want to work, and they're constantly making noise, and they think it's their right to work from home. They think it's their right to work 20, 30 hours a week. They don't want to advance, blah, 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 all this sort of stuff. I guess my advice to him was maybe a bit generic and maybe incorrect. I think there are differences in generations, but I think some truths are fairly universal. And I've uncovered a couple things which have worked for me. But every manager has their own style. And because of that, and every company has its own culture and its own goals. And so there's a thing as culture market fit. So certain leaders will do well in certain kinds of companies, right? Who have certain kinds of cultures made for the market they're in. This is not generic advice for everybody. But for me, I like to work in startups, and I like to work in, startups which are working on, I would say, kind of top line problems, which means not efficiency related problems so much as innovation related problems. How do we discover the next big thing? Which feature is going to work with customers, et cetera? And in such places, you need people who are motivated by they need intrinsic creative motivation. Carrot and stick
Got
stuff
it.
doesn't work. Carrot and stick will work for a customer service team, for a sales team. It'll work for an IT team at a Fortune 500 who's shipping the same things over and over again. But for creative teams, they really need to care about it intrinsically. They need to be interested in the puzzle. They want to solve the puzzle. You can't sort of motivate them other ways. And I think this applies to younger generation as much as older ones. The best thing to do is to basically, it's a very simple formula. It sounds cliched, but figure out where the hell you're going, why you should go there, and everyone on the team should know where you're going, and they should know why they're important to that strategy, what they're doing that's important, and they should believe it themselves that it can work. And then they should believe that if it works, you're going to take care of them. And if you solve those things, they will work hard and they will
Right.
try to solve problems. A lot of companies think they can shortchange that by having a crappy strategy, by having, a lot of program management, which removes people from the real problem they're solving, by treating people as numbers on a spreadsheet. Naturally, you're going to get, you know, poorer results when you do that.
Totally. I think very well answered, Jacob. I think finding that culture market fit and finding the place where you will also fit in naturally, you would be easily able to align with the folks who are working there and maybe lead them better. I think that analogy is really, really good here. Apart from that, do you think like not everyone gets that opportunity to find the right place for themselves, right? When there is dearth of opportunities in the market, what would be the advice for the leaders that they should apply on them when they are not in the culture market fit scenario?
Leaders, you mean if a leader is in an organization where they don't feel like the
Yeah.
values of the exec team align to their
Right,
value,
right, right. Yeah,
engineering
yeah.
or CTO, some
Correct, correct.
good question. Best thing to do is probably to quit. But if you can't afford, I mean, I say that a bit flippantly. I'm not saying quit early. I'm not saying don't try. I mean, if you really have a true values alignment problem, then that's hard to get over. If it's
Right,
tactical, if it's relationship based, you can work on those things, right? If you feel like you have to be someone you don't like to fit in an organization, then that's unlikely to change if it comes from the top, right? It's a very cliched saying, but be careful who you work with. You're more likely to become them than they are to become you. And so I would say that. But to get more practical, let's say if you can't or you're feeling challenged, etc. Your question was basically, okay, so let's say we're a VP engineering or a director of engineering and you're unhappy with the leadership in some way, right?
Yeah. So no, I think it
Um,
makes sense. The advice is generic, but it definitely gives you the direction where you should be thinking when you are stuck in such a situation. You
well,
can't
I
really
think,
fight against.
yeah, I will say a couple of things. This also, the same conversation I had mentioned earlier, this also came up with the typical thing of leadership not trusting tech. They don't think we're doing anything. They think we're moving too slow. They think we're, sandbagging everything, et cetera. And to solve that, I think, which is not a values problem, that's the case in almost every organization. I mean, there's never been a CEO who said, "Oh man, the tech team's so fast. I can't come up with dumb ideas fast enough. They keep implementing everything so quickly." It's never happened in the history of companies. So there's always that conflict, which is natural and healthy. But I think to get over that, that's basically a transparency problem. Usually, it's like, are you clear on your sprint reviews? Do you do them in public? Do you share a lot of information around the progress made? Do you share it in a way that gets consumed or not? Are you A/B testing stuff? Are you able to look at numbers? Able to talk numbers with your business teams? Do you know the impact of features you're releasing? Can you measure it? Right? If you can measure it, release that information. If you can give timely updates in a way which is entertaining and appropriate for the audience, that they actually listen, those problems tend to go away. Then it just,
Yeah.
the main problem there is not that people don't trust you. It's just that you're a black box to them. They don't understand your language. And so you have to find, techniques to get
Ways to
over
bring
that.
that visibility.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. Great, great. All right, coming back to enhancing the developer experience there. So there are multiple areas where you can see developer experience taking ahead or working well, right? So which are those areas which you feel are getting impacted with this enhancement of developer experience, and how you have worked upon those in any one of your experiences in the past with any of the companies?
You said enhancement of developer experience. What do you mean by that?
And so I'll repeat my question. Maybe I confused you with too many words there. So in your previous experiences, you must have worked with many teams, and there would have been various areas that could have impacted the developer experience. So just to give you a very simple example, as you talked about the tooling, the people whom they're working with. So there could be multiple issues that impact the developer experience, right? So in your previous experiences, where you found out a specific developer experience related problem, and how did you solve it, how it was impacting the overall delivery of the development team. Just want to like deep dive into that experience of yours.
Yeah. So I think a big one was, I can talk about Grofers. So one of the things we had when I first came to Grofers, we had about 50, 60 people in tech, product engineering, data design, etc. We had them into different pods. That was good. Someone had created like different teams for different parts of the application. So it wasn't just a free flowing pool of labor. There was the shopping cart team and the browsing team and the supply chain, like the warehouse management team, the last mile team. It was like, 4 or 5 teams. But there was a shared mobile team. So the
Mhm.
front end, there was one Android team, there was one iOS team, there was one web team, which again is very common, not necessarily a bad idea. But what ended up happening was that the business teams wouldn't trust the tech deadlines, because a lot of times what would happen is there'd be a bunch of backend engineers in the shopping cart team. They'd finish something, and then they'd be stuck on the front end team, because the front end team was working on something or the Android team was working on something for the browsing team, right? The iOS team was free, so they would build that shopping cart feature, but they couldn't really release it yet because the releases had to go out together with Android and iOS, because the backend release had to go with that. So we're waiting on this one. Then we're waiting on the web one. And there's this cascading waiting that's happening. And
Right.
now the shopping cart team is like, well, we're done with our part. We're waiting on Android. So we're going to start a new feature. So they start a new feature. And then again, the problem starts again, where that feature is then waiting on somebody else, waiting on the QA team or waiting on somebody else. So all of these waiting aspects that happen ruin the developer experience, because the developer can't finish something. They get something half done, but it's not out in production. So they can't forget about it. Production's a
Right.
moving target. The more teams you have, the more frequently it's changing. So you have to go back and revisit that code. It's stale now. You've forgotten it, right? And you haven't actually released anything to customers. So the business teams are like, what the hell? You said you're done. You said you'd be done 2 weeks ago. And you're like, oh, I'm waiting for this team. Stop giving me excuses, right?
Right.
That team's waiting
Right.
on some other team. So I think one of the big things we did was we took a hard call and say, at the time, Grofers was not quick commerce. At the time, Grofers was like Dmart online. cheap discounting, 2-3 day delivery. And we scaled up massively on that proposition. And we said, hey, like people who care about the price of bread being 5% less or more, do they own iPhones? No, they do not own iPhones. That's like 5% of our population. So we just
Right.
ditched the iPhone team, cross-trained people on Android. We took all the Android engineers and we put them into the individual teams. We also took QA, automated most of our tests, and put QA resources into each of the teams as SDETs, and kind of removed those horizontal shared services teams and put them in fully cross-functional teams. And that improved developer experience a lot. And then it's kind of obvious, like people talk about cross-functional teams and being able to get everything done within a team, being more efficient, less waiting for the teams. But it has another huge benefit. And the other huge benefit is motivation-wise. You cannot expect, like I said earlier, you want your engineers to care about the business outcomes. You want them to understand the strategy. They don't understand why they're building it. But if an engineer has to build something, send it to the team, get that team to send it to some other team, get that team to send it to some other team, to a release team to get released eventually, right? And then the results come back 3 months later. You can't expect that engineer to be excited about their metrics, their business metrics and the outcomes.
Right.
When you put everyone in one team, they operate like a small startup and they just continually crank that wheel and put out new things to continually get feedback and learn. And they improve their part of the business. And it's much more motivating and they're much more creative as a result. And I think that changes the whole experience for a developer. It just reduces those loops, those learning loops. You get a sense of progress and a sense of productivity. And that's really the most motivating thing.
Totally makes sense. And it's a very good example. I think this is how you should reshape teams time to time based on the business requirements, and the business scale is what's going to impact the developer experience here. But what I'm thinking here is that this would have become a very evident problem while executing, right? Your project is not getting shipped and the business teams are probably out there standing waiting for the release to happen, and you started feeling that pain and why it is happening, and you went on solving it. But there could be multiple other issues when you scale up, and 50-60 is a very good number actually. But when you go beyond that, there are small teams releasing something or the other on everyday basis. How exactly would you go about measuring the developer experience on different areas? So, of course, this was one, like your sprints were delayed or your deliverables were delayed. This was evident. But how do you go about finding in general what's going on and how developers are feeling?
Well, I mean, we hit those scaling things. And like you said, yes, people are delayed. It sounds obvious, but it's mostly not. Most leaders actually take exactly the opposite approach. They say,
Oh,
okay, no more excuses. We're going to plan everything out at the beginning of the quarter. You plan your project. We'll do all the downstream mapping with every other Android, iOS, QA team required. We'll allocate all their bandwidth ahead of time. So we'll never have this problem again. And we'll put program managers in place to make sure the whole thing happens. They go the opposite direction, which I think is kind of, it never works, to be honest.
yeah, of
Um,
course.
in terms of measuring developer experience as you scale, so we got up to like 220 people in tech, I think, at some point at Grofers, and we scaled up very quickly. That was within a year and a half or something that happened, and you know that became much more challenging. I honestly don't love the word developer experience because it doesn't mean anything specifically. Because there's sort of your experience as an employee, right?
Yeah, right.
HR kind of related stuff, your manager, whatever. There's your experience, as an engineer, like the tools you're using and stuff like that, right?
Yep,
And then
yep.
your
Yes.
experience like as a team member, like your colleagues, your manager, your kind of stuff like that, right? So it's slightly different from an employee in terms of it's not about company confidence and stuff or strategy, but more about your relationships. So there's different areas of it. For measuring like general like satisfaction, we use things like Office Vibe. We use things like continuous performance improvement tool like 15.5. We brought in OKRs, a lot of things which kind of are there to connect people to strategy and regularly check in and make sure that we're
If
not
they're
losing
aligned
things.
towards it.
All of those were effective in pockets, depending on usage. But by far the most effective thing, and I know this might not be the popular answer when it comes to what Typo sells, although I do like the product a lot, which is why I'm doing this. 'Cause I think it's a cool product. A lot of it is really just like one-on-ones, just making sure that every manager does a one-on-one like every 2 weeks, and making it like put it in some kind of spreadsheet, some kind of lightweight thing, but making sure that new managers learn that they have to do it, how to do them well, how to connect with individuals, understand their motivations, and like follow through on stuff and make small improvements in their life. Like That's the cheat
No,
code.
that's it.
It's just doing the hard work of being a manager, following through with people, listening to them. That being
Totally,
said,
totally.
data helps. So like what you guys have, what you guys build, I've built small versions of that. I wrote a script which would look at all the repositories, see how long things are sitting in PR, look at Jira, see how long things are sitting in wait, build continuous flow sort of diagrams, sort of just showing people where your
Yeah.
value stream is getting stuck. I've like hand coded some of that stuff, and it's been helpful to start conversations. It's been helpful to convince people that need to change their ideas about what's happening.
Right.
I think those are some of the ideas.
Thanks for promoting typo there. But yeah, I think that also makes sense. It's not necessary that you have to have a tooling in place, but in general, having a tap on these metrics or the understanding of how things are flowing in the team is critical. And probably that's from where you understand where the developer experience and the experience of the team members would be impacted. One thing you mentioned that you scaled very rapidly at
Yep.
Grofers, and it was from 50 to 250, right? One interesting piece, I think we were having this discussion at the time of SaaS Boomi also, the code review experience, right?
Yeah.
Because at that scale, it becomes really difficult to, like, let's
Yeah.
even for a director of engineering to go into the code and see how it is flowing, where things are getting stuck. So this code review experience in itself, I'm sure this impacts a lot of the developer experience piece, so to say. So how did you manage that and how it flowed there for you?
Well, one is I didn't manage it directly. So like Grofers was big enough that I had a director of engineering sort of or VP engineering for different divisions. And that level of being hands-on in terms of code reviews, I wouldn't really participate in other than like, sometimes as an observer, or sometimes to show proof if we're doing something new, like we're doing automation, I might whip up some sample code, show people, do a review here and there for a specific purpose about something, but never
Right.
like generally manage the like look at that. Grofers was really good this way. I think we had a really good academic culture where people did like public code reviews. There wasn't this like protection shame kind of thing. It was very open. We had a big open source culture. We used to host lots of open source meetups. There was a lot of positive sort of view of inquiry and learning. It wasn't looked at as a threatening thing, which a lot of organizations it's looked at as a threatening kind of
Yeah.
thing and a gatekeeping thing, which I think we try to discourage. So I think we had a lot of really positive aspects of that. Vedic Kapoor was heading DevOps and security, infrastructure stuff. Who I work with a lot. He's consulting now, doing this kind of work. He did a lot of great sort of workshops and a lot of like a continuous improvement program with his teams around this kind of stuff, where they do public reviews every so often, every week or whatever. And the DevOps teams made a big point of being that service team for the engineers. So they would kind of build features for engineers. So we had a developer experience team essentially because we were that size. On the review process generally, I mean, I gave this rant at SaaS Boomi, and I think I've given it often. I think PRs are one of the worst things that's happened to software engineering in the last
Yeah,
20
you
years.
mentioned that.
Yeah, and I think it's a real problem. And it's this funny thing where everyone assumes that progress moves forward and it never goes backwards. And then the younger generation doesn't necessarily believe that it could have been better before. But I'll tell you the reason why I say that is that Git was created by Linus, by the creator of Linux, because they needed something immediately, but also they needed something which would allow thousands and thousands of people working at different companies with different motivations to all collaborate on the same project. And so it's the branching and the sub branching and the sub branching, which Git allowed people to simultaneously work on many different branches and then sort of merge them late and review them in any order they wanted to and discuss them at length to get them in, and had to be very secure and very stable at the end of the day. And that made a lot of sense, right? It's very asynchronous and things take a very long time to finish. That's not how your software team works. You guys are all sitting around the same table. What are you doing? Like, you don't need to do that. You could just be like, hey, look at this, right? There's a different way to do it. Even if you're on a remote team, you could be like, let's do a screen share, or can I meet you tomorrow at 2 or whatever, and we'll go through this. Or like, I had some ideas, paste in Slack, get back to me when you can, here's my patch, whatever. And I think what ends up happening is that the GitHub, and for open source projects, it's huge. Git is amazing. Pull requests are amazing. They've enabled a lot. But if you are a team where you all kind of work in the same code base, you all kind of work closely together, there's no reason to send up this long asynchronous process where it can take anywhere between a couple hours to I've seen a couple weeks to get a review done. And it creates a logjam, and that slows down teams, and that reduces, again, that loop. I'm big on loops. Like, I think you should be able to run your code in less than a second. You should be able to compile as quickly as possible. You should be able to test things as quickly as possible. That you should be able to get things to the market and review them as quickly as possible. You should get a feedback from your colleague as soon as possible. And like, I think a lot of that has gotten worse. So engineers like learn slower, and they're waiting more. They're waiting for PRs to get reviewed. There's politics around it. And so I think that process probably should change. More frequent reviews, pairing, sort of
TDDs probably.
reviews, etc. Yeah, and TDD, if you can do it, is kind of the way to get much faster loops, productivity loops going, get things out sooner. Sorry, a bit of a long rant, but yeah, PRs
I
suck.
think this is really interesting, how we move from enhancing developer experience and how code reviews should be done better, because that ultimately impacts the overall experience. And that's what most of the developers are doing most of the time. So I think that makes sense. And it was,
I just want to caveat that before you misquote me. I'm not saying formal reviews are bad. You should also have a formal review, but it should be a formality. Like, you should have already done so many reviews informally along the way that anyone who's reviewing it already kind of knows it's there. And then the formal review happens. And it's like in the books, and we've looked at it and we put the comments. It shouldn't just be like, here's a 20K patch the day before the deadline. You know what I mean? That shouldn't happen anymore. I think that's what I'm trying to say.
yeah. No, totally makes sense. I think this last piece was very interesting, and we can have a complete discussion, a podcast totally on this piece itself. So I'll stop here, and thank you so much for your time today, for discussing all these aspects of developer experience and how code reviews should be done better. Any parting advice, Jacob, for the dev teams of the modern age?
The dev teams or their managers? I guess the managers are probably watching this more than
Whichever you like.
any parting advice. I would say that we're at the most exciting time to be an engineer since, maybe I'm biased, but since I started coding. When I started coding, it was like just as the web was taking off. Like I remember when like CSS was released, that's old. So it's like, oh shit, this is great. This is so much fun, like when it started getting adoption, right? So I think like the sort of dynamic programmable web was when I started, right? And now we're at the second most exciting one, in my opinion, as an engineer. And I think it's surprising to me. I work with a lot of portfolio companies at AlphaWave. I talk to new companies that I'm looking at investing in. It's really surprising to me how few of them use Copilot or Cursor or these various sort of AI tools to assist in development, or like everyone uses them a little bit, but not programmatically. They don't really look into it too much. And I think that's a missed opportunity. I still code. When I code, I use them extensively. I'm on ChatGPT, I'm on Copilot. I pay for all these subscriptions. I use Shell GPT. I don't remember shell commands anymore. Shell GPT, by the way, is great. I'm gonna plug. Write what you want to do, hit Control L, it'll like generate the shell command for you. Like, even stuff I know how to do, it's faster. But the main thing is like the yak shaving goes away. So I don't know if you guys know yak shaving, but yak shaving is this idea of having to do all this configuration, all this setup, all this screwing around to get the thing actually working before you can start coding. Like learning some new framework or dependency management, bullshit like that. That stuff is so much better now. You take your errors, you paste it into ChatGPT, it explains it. It's right most of the time. You can ask them to build config scripts. So I think if you know how to use the tool, you can just be a million times more productive. So I would say lean into it. Don't be intimidated by it. Definitely don't shortchange it. Dedicate some research effort. Trust your engineers. Buy those subscriptions. It's $20 a month. Don't be so cheap, please. Indian engineering managers are really cheap with tooling. I think a lot of time. Just spend it. It's fine. It's going to be worth it. I think that was my big thing right now.
Great, Jacob. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this. Would love to have another discussion with you on any of the topics you love in the coming shows. And for today, I think thanks a lot once again.
Same here. Good talking to you, Kovid. All right. See you.
Thank you. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Happy hacking.